Greetings and welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of UC Weekly News. I'm your host, David Danto, and I have a terrific guest with me this week. Eric, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell everybody who you are and what you do in our industry.
Great. First of all, Dave, thanks for having me. Really excited to have this conversation with you. I'm Eric Hanson. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Mitel, and Mitel is a business communications company that's been around for quite some time, about 50 years, globally, one of the largest UC providers in the industry, and really excited to share more about what we're doing with you.
So before we talk about Mitel, let's talk about Eric. Give us a quick history of your journey into the industry and to where you got to where you are today.
In terms of my journey, I'm an unusual CMO. I actually started in sales as an enterprise seller during the sort of dawn of digital transformation that was occurring in the media and entertainment industry. And flash forward a few years, I actually ended up being an entrepreneur. I had my own company doing visual effects. And in the sort of early to late 2000s, found myself in a conference room reviewing visual effects shots for Avatar. And I turned to my business partner because we were using Skype, a niche product called CineSync that allowed you to have synchronized QuickTime movie review with remote artists. And I said, there's got to be a better way to doing this. And of course, this is years before COVID and the whole wave around remote work. And so out of that, I entered the communications industry after I sold that company. And the company was called Fusebox, and we were web and video communications product that later was acquired by another company. And that's really how I got started into this industry. I played roles in sales. I had my own company for a period of time. I also was the head of product for that company at one point in time. So I really had sort of danced between sales, product, and then, of course, marketing. And I like to consider myself a recovering product marketer, actually.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, in our industry, everybody is in sales and everybody is in marketing. Many of them just don't realize it, but it's what we do all the time. So
100%.
that's an interesting journey. So explain to me who Mitel is from the perspective. What was the movie line? As if I was a 7-year-old. Explain it to me as if I don't know anything about the industry.
Sure. So obviously the needs of organizations, especially larger organizations, require a different type of communications than perhaps we use in our personal lives, right? In many cases, you have lots of people working a retail floor, or you've got an organization that needs to connect, if they're in manufacturing, the assembly line floor to the back office. Those scenarios are much more advanced than just typical communications. And so really, I think at the heart of unified communications, and specifically with Mitel, there's a history of Mitel basically, driving innovation around how do you streamline and simplify those types of communication scenarios for all types of users. And so, we have 50 years of doing that. Company was started out of Ottawa, and certainly, has a global presence at this point in time.
So what's Mitel's view of what's going on in the unified communication industry? You've had a lot of mergers and acquisitions. You've had a lot of companies come in, go out, some changes. Everybody's obsessed with AI right now. What would be Mitel's short version of what's going on in the industry?
Well, I think, and it's not just Mitel's view. I think there are a lot of industry analysts that have been tracking the market for quite some time, and certainly, Dave, you've been around the industry for a very long time as well. Even though you're still 29, I'm not sure at what point you started, but no, seriously, I think these trends come and go, right? There was a ton of craze around video, obviously around COVID for obvious reasons. And then over time, some of those trends become really features rather than categories, right? I think things like AI, kind of follow a similar pattern in that it's really exciting. It's also scary for some people as we think about privacy concerns and otherwise. But relative to communications, I always view these types of things as enablers, right? At the end of the day, we still have to help organizations do business and keep their people connected with their partners, with their customers. That's the problem we're solving. And if you ask any CEO or CIO or CFO, they don't care whether that's done from the public cloud, the private cloud, they just want the problem to be solved, and they want to drive their business, right? And so I think Mitel's view in terms of where this is going is certain aspects of the market have commoditized and become much more straightforward. Certainly servicing knowledge workers is one of those areas, right? But then when you start thinking about vertical markets, or you start thinking about larger enterprise, especially on a global basis, in highly regulated countries or industries for that matter, then the nuances become more important, right? The value associated with supporting those nuances to those businesses become more important. And that's where we believe the market's really going next in terms of how do you really solve those types of problems for large organizations today while preparing for them for tomorrow, regardless of what the platform is that it needs to sit on to solve those problems.
So do you think it's really going to be an as a service world for most users?
I think that flexibility is going to be important. I think for some organizations, I also think it's funny, Dave, that we've mixed this metaphor of as a service with being synonymous with cloud, because one is a deployment model, as you know, and the other is really more about commercial terms,
Right.
capex versus opex. I think our perspective, and certainly my perspective, having been in this industry for a long time, is mileage varies by organization, by CIO, by CEO, and what they're trying to drive in terms of priorities from the business perspective. And so for some, that already have a significant investment and maybe have depreciated assets, it's more valuable for it to be a capex type of scenario, and therefore they're going to want commercial terms that reflect that and technology that reflects that. In other cases, regardless of whether it's cloud or even hardware, there's certainly a lot of device as a service out there as well, where it's basically more of a subscription type model that may make more sense for a given organization. And from our perspective, we believe in choice and flexibility, and we want to be able to support all of those scenarios, but still have that common fabric and connective tissue that ultimately ends up solving the use cases that are required to drive that company's business.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations out there right now, and I'm not going to call any of them out that believe that the only solution is jumping headfirst into the pool. That you've got to be all cloud, or you've got to be all their cloud, or you've got to be all their cloud with AI and their assistant, and I think, as you pointed out, that the nuances really do matter. It's not a one size fits all world. And I assume that that's the Mitel perspective as well.
100%. And I would argue that the reason that many of those organizations are pitching it that way is because that's all they have, right? They have made a big bet in their business that that's how they're going to go for various reasons. And I think one of the interesting things, not just in the communication space, if you look at even things like the gaming industry, right, is I think a good proxy for this in terms of, there were consoles that sat in your home, then it was online gaming, then it was online gaming where rendering was happening locally, but data was transmitting remotely. Are we really in a much different situation, whether we call it distributed computing, remote, edge? I think at the end of the day, some sort of hybrid model in terms of how you distributed processing power, if that's what makes sense for the business model and for driving, real-time interaction, great. And if there's some sort of hybrid of how that technology is used, that's great too. I think we'll see that with AI. We're certainly seeing signs of local processing because these large language models are so big that you want to transmit remotely, whether it's private cloud or public cloud or whatever it is, but then processing locally, right? So I don't think this conversation is over. I think we'll continue to see this pendulum continue to swing back and forth, again, based on what's right for the business, based on what's right for solving those use cases.
Yeah,
Does
that
that make
actually
sense?
Yeah, that kind of opened my eyes. I had recently moderated a conversation at IT Expo around endpoints, and I asked the general question, where do you see the AI living? And the consensus amongst multiple manufacturers and service providers were that it is going to live more and more in the endpoints. And if you think about it, that really makes sense in terms of the speed of processing. You can't have a self-driving car, and this came up on our show last week. You can't have a self-driving car asking the cloud if it's a good idea whether or not it hits the baby carriage. There's got to
Right.
be the ability to be able to make that decision faster, locally communicate data to the cloud back and forth, and collect data any way you want. But that we're going to have to see the endpoints be much smarter in the nuance of communication as we go forward.
Yeah, I would argue that NVIDIA is betting on that, right? I mean, they did it in the gaming industry. They're probably thinking about it in the same way relative to AI. It would be my bet, just my personal opinion. But I think you bring up another point that's really important relative to communications and specifically unified communications. When you start thinking about these nuanced use cases that I mentioned earlier, think about an operating room. We both know because we've seen the development and evolution of voice over IP. But in a lot of cases, whether it was the early days of Skype or where we are today with video conferencing, certainly the technology's gotten better, but the hairpinning that goes out and back, even if you're in the same building, can be problematic when you've got a mission critical use case and milliseconds matter. Think about an operating room, right? We talk about remote operations and supervision relative to a mission critical use case like that. But until the connectivity, you can't process some of those things remotely. You've got to actually have real-time interaction at the endpoint in the room to really support those types of mission critical, in this case, gravely mission critical types of scenarios, right? So I think there's a lot more conversation to be had around this. And again, it's the right tool for the right job, right? Like, let's use the technology and focus more on what's a given organization trying to solve for to drive their business, and then let's bring the right set of things together to solve that problem with a end-to-end solution.
And that's even more applicable when you talk about the essentially the commoditization of the endpoints that are out there right now. The first video conference rooms in the days that you were talking about and I was talking about, we were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars or up to $100,000, depending upon the room you're talking about. The first video bar came out, 5 years ago. It was amazing. And
Right.
now everybody's got a video bar, and you're seeing it from companies you've never heard of before. Same thing when it comes to telephony. We've been announcing the death of the desktop telephone for 20 years, and it's just not going away because people like the form factor and people are using it. So as it commoditizes the service end of the industry, the vertical services, and how we differentiate and how we understand what those actual needs are with use assessments and modeled support is really what's going to differentiate organizations.
Yeah, I like something that you said earlier. You used a phrase that I use quite often, which is the one size fits all. And I think that we need to leave that behind for some of these industries, right? Because even if the use case is the same between, say, one healthcare provider and another healthcare provider, in the and the technology is the same, the way that they use the technology with their set of actual users is going to be different. And so I think the other component to this is not just about the products and capabilities. It's also about how you integrate with the rest of the ecosystem that exists in that environment. So integrations with things that are maybe less horizontal, right? If you think about whether it's healthcare or you think about financial services or lending, they're not using Salesforce necessarily as an example. They're using their own type of ERP or CRM that is very specific to that industry. And so those types of understandings around what's important to how a product like the Mitel portfolio fits into that ecosystem is nuanced in even an individual customer perspective. And I'm not suggesting that every customer should be a snowflake. That doesn't scale. But certainly understanding those nuances and then being able to tailor solutions to fit those needs with professional services and an openness in the platform, I think is super critical to actually do something that's differentiated.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, one phrase that keeps coming up when I was talking to people about Mitel is life cycle management.
Yes.
Explain to me why that's such a big deal for Mitel and what's going on with it.
It's a great question. I think both in my past and in my current role, everything always starts with the customer, and I work backwards from there. It's the recovering product marketer or product manager in me, I guess. And I think when you think about the tenure that Mitel has had in the industry, and the fact that last year we acquired Unify, which came out of Siemens, so it's another company that's been around for a very long time. And you put those two companies together, and the size of the install base is, if not the largest, one of the largest in the industry, right? And so your ability to help support and evolve services to continue to support that size of an install base becomes very important, not just for those customers, but also for us as an organization. And so really, I think, we call it CLM. Really, I think what that's designed to do is to put that customer first and to then map out customer journeys and how we, not just about from a product perspective, but how we do business together. And I think that that's one of the important things, especially when you're bringing two families together like Unify and Mitel under the Mitel brand. That becomes even that much more important. So we're doing a lot of things, both in terms of the business side of things, in terms of how you better support and have that flexibility to support the different stages of the life cycle with those customers. And then from a product perspective, as we think about things like, of course, you have to end of life certain devices as you bring out new devices. What does that migration plan look like? How do you think about it from the customer's perspective and what's going to be important to them? And what type of runway do you need to give them to make those types of transitions? And then on top of that, you also have to be very thoughtful, and we're not necessarily the first to do this. Certainly, I love what Okta has done over the years in this respect, but it's about how do you help organizations realize the most value out of the investments that they're making. And so having that type of relationship that is not just about, hey, I want to sell you something else, or we want to migrate you to something else. But hey, you've made this investment in us. We want to invest in you and make sure you're maximizing that investment. And so that's really important to us as we think about customer outcomes.
Yeah, relationships are probably the most important thing in our industry and in many industries. So it was good
100%.
seeing you and your team last week at Enterprise Connect. It's good surviving another Enterprise Connect. Let's leave it at that. But what announcements did you make, or what kind of is your roadmap for 2024? What are you looking forward to that you talked about there, and that maybe you didn't talk about there?
Yeah, sure. So we were in the process of obviously bringing together. A lot of people are very interested in how these two companies that are pretty large are coming together from both a portfolio perspective and just in terms of how we do business, right? And so certainly a lot of the conversations that we had at Enterprise Connect were really surrounding that. What's next? And we didn't make any formal announcements, but we're in the process of actually formally announcing some things to the rest of the market. But certainly with analysts and industry influencers and some of the business consultants out there that support the unified communications industry, we started to pre-brief them on where we're going with the roadmap in terms of topics like AI, right? And I'm glad that you brought AI up. We're very similar to Apple in that we're kind of stepping back and we don't want to announce things that aren't going to drive real customer value, right? We want to actually think about how does it fit into the use cases? How does it drive value today
Oh,
as
come on,
well as
you don't want to
enabling for
get on the
tomorrow?
hype train with everybody else? You don't want to
Most
announce
people on the
17
hype
different
train
AI
can't sell
products?
AI, Dave.
I actually just posted an article a couple of weeks ago about how we need to calm down with this AI thing because it's not as much of a nirvana as people are making it out to be. It's exciting, it's interesting. We need to know about it. We need to be prepared for it in business, but I don't think it's something we should be relying on just yet because there's a lot of scary bubbles that I think might burst.
I couldn't agree more. And as a marketer, there's certain aspects of where it fits into the workflow of my team, for instance, and how it can drive some efficiencies. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier, it's an enabling technology. It's not the end all be all replacement. You still need carbon based assets to drive creativity, in my opinion. And if everybody's using the same large language models and so forth, things become vanilla pretty quickly, right? So I think it's an enabler. I think it can help us just like the calculator helped us, 50 years ago. But it isn't going to replace human thought, problem solving, and those types of things in the foreseeable future. So the question to me is how do you fit it into the workflows that are actually going to drive value, whether that's customer experience, whether that's efficiencies and enabling your team to scale more widely. I think there's a lot of opportunities from that perspective and things like contact center, which obviously a lot of people are talking about. And we actually had a lot of virtual agent things that we didn't talk a lot about, but we released back in 2019. And so for us, this is really about an evolution of what makes sense, again, coming back to driving real customer value. I think unfortunately, in this industry, there is a lot of hype and you have a lot of vendors. And, I've certainly had conversations with some of our peers in the industry that track the market. And my question is always the same. Of the vendors you're tracking, how many of them are talking about AI and how many of them are actually monetizing? How many of them are actually delivering actual features today that are driving value for customers? And the answer is they're talking a lot about it, but they're not necessarily shipping things or people aren't necessarily buying it. Of course, they're interested because they want to see what's coming. But I think we're a ways away before we really see the rubber meet the road on that. And we'll be ready, and we are doing some things and we will be making some announcements this year on that front. I think the other thing, getting back to things that we announced this last week and that we're talking a lot about, certainly our vertical strategy. There are some things that come out of the merger of Unify and Mitel that we'll be bringing out and starting to go GA with that are really focused on healthcare. And that's just one example of these very tailored solutions that solve real customer needs and patient needs. And those are the types of things that you're going to see from us, not just in terms of what we were talking about last week, but also you'll see lots more of that as we start to talk about some specific vertical markets. And so that'll be a really important part of our strategy in 2024 and heading into 2025.
I hope when you make those announcements, you get a chance to come back on and chat with us again and maybe brief some of the people that watch this about what's going on in the world of Unify and Mitel, which is now Mitel. So I do thank you. If somebody wants to reach out to you about some of the things that you spoke about or wants to find out more information about Mitel in general, how would you suggest they proceed?
Sure. So our website is mitel.com, and I can always be reached via LinkedIn is probably the best. And I'm just Eric Hanson on the LinkedIn platform. So feel free to reach out to me.
Eric, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the insights. I appreciate the calculator analogy, although honestly, I don't recall my Bomar brain ever hallucinating, but I think we have to work through that as an industry as well. But thanks for taking the time to be here.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate you having me, and great to see you again.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much for watching us every week. For UC Weekly News, I'm David Danto. We'll catch you on the next one.